I apologize in advance for a grim perspective, a doomsday scenario that I'm about to sketch. But I thought articulation of this anxiety has some point, because that's probably the only civilized means available for dispelling it by reflection. As was pointed out, education makes us unhappy. So this is one discourse in unhappiness I would like to spell out. I've titled my paper Education for the Species. At one point I was mulling over an alternative title, perhaps something like Education for Nurturing Stupidity. So that's another play on the notion of stupidity that was suggested by my first speaker, whether stupidity in fact is a virtue for saving the species. And I think that's this title is closer to the truth, even if it is too outlandish to be an official title. To sketch the perspective I have in mind, let me go back to Noam Chomsky's grimly titled book of 2005, Hegemony or Survival, which I hope many of you have read, and it's a must-read. Now, this book opens with some observations of the great contemporary biologist Ernst Mayr of Harvard University. Now, Mayr holds that about 50 billion species have appeared on this planet since the origin of life. And he estimates that the average life expectancy of a species is about 100,000 years. Now, we might debate the notion of a species here, but that's about the rough calculation, 100,000 years for the life of a species. It so happens that exactly one of these 50 billion species achieved the kind of intelligence needed to establish a civilization, and that's us. And I'm going to play on this idea of the kind of intelligence, civilizational or civilization-forming intelligence that is under issue here, or under threat here. Now, from studies on the expansion of the brain size, proliferation of tools and other cultural artifacts, it is now estimated that the human species emerged roughly about 100,000 years ago. Following Mayer's statistical rule, then, the species is possibly nearing its end. Now, it stands to reason that species typically become extinct due to what may broadly be called natural reasons that occur periodically in nature anyway. These include appearance of a virulent virus, malignant mutations, onset and offset of ice ages at a geological scale, strike of giant meteors, sudden changes in environment niches and the like, on which really the species have, individual organisms have no control, even as populations have no control. It's an externalities that determine the life of the species in most cases. This does not seem to be true in our case. At the current stage of knowledge, there is no definite prediction that the human species is about to become extinct due to one such a natural reason. The prediction rather is that the species is most likely to disappear due to phenomena such as nuclear holocaust, massive environmental destruction, global conflict including biological warfare, very, very real things, astronomical poverty leading to large-scale famines, irreversible damage to food chains, maybe even just unavailability of potable water. The extinction of the species will most likely be species-made. Significantly, each of these doomsday scenarios is critically linked to the species' unique endowment of the kind of intelligence needed to establish a civilization. No other species remotely has the ability to pollute much of the potable water of the planet by its own diligent effort in just a few hundred years, not to mention the ability to construct weapons of mass destruction. As Mayr pointed out, there is no evidence that nature prefers intelligence over stupidity. Beetles and bacteria, for example, are vastly more successful than the great apes, not to mention humans, in terms of survival. Looking at humans through this long lens of evolution, it could well be, Chomsky holds, that humans were kind of a biological error, using their allotted 100,000 years to destroy themselves and much else in the process with cold and calculated savagery. The centrality of the notions of intelligence and stupidity brings the topic of the imminent extinction of the species within the broad domain of education, hence the title. In the said book, Chomsky himself traces the choice between hegemony or survival, that's the title of the book, as I said, at first narrowly to America's quest for global dominance. And that's the subtitle of the book, America's quest for global dominance. No doubt with its absolute military control over the planet and the space around it, and its nuclear hardware capable of vaporizing much of the planetary system, the US has represented the peak of the cold and calculated savagery with which humans have proceeded to destroy themselves. Moreover, using its military control, the US has thwarted almost every effort to get the planet on some track of recovery. For example, in the last few decades, it has not only ignored the Geneva Convention on Warfare and UN resolutions on terrorism, it has walked out of the Kyoto Protocol on the Environment, the ABM Treaty, the Convention on Biological Warfare, among others, and the list is very, very long. There is some basis then for viewing US hegemony as a principal agent for the imminent extinction of the species. However, as Chomsky pointed out, the basic problem is much deeper and historical in character than the immediacy of a current rogue state. Thus, even if the current neoliberal phase represents the extreme end of the traditional US foreign policy, these policies have many precursors, both in US history and among early aspirants to global power. More ominously, Chomsky continued, their decisions may not be irrational within the framework of prevailing ideology and institutions that embody it. And that's the most dangerous thing, that these are rational decisions taken in a civilizational mode over hundreds of years of the most sophisticated thinking. I return to the ideology and institutions that foster such rational decisions. It is instructive in this connection to turn to US as apparently benign, to just expand the argument really. It's not just US or corporate power. It is instructive in this connection to turn to US as apparently benign and peace-loving country Canada. Who thinks of Canada as a cause of extinction of species? To turn to that country Canada to understand the real scope of the concerned ideology. Speaking recently on the energy policies of the Canadian government under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, Chomsky observed, and I quote, "It means taking every drop of hydrocarbon out of the ground, whether it's shale gas in New Brunswick or tar sands in Alberta, and trying to destroy the environment as fast as possible, with barely a question raised about what the world will look like as a result." Most importantly for our purposes, Chomsky also sketched an alternative to these entrenched ideologies by applauding the resistance against these policies raised by the indigenous people congregating at the margins of Canada's much-flaunted multicultural society. It is pretty ironic, Chomsky remarked, that the so-called least advanced people are the ones taking the lead in trying to protect all of us, while the richest and the most powerful among us are the ones who are trying to drive the society to destruction and to the species extinction. The general lesson is hard to miss. Notice the expression, all of us. The resistance to the extraction of hydrocarbon by the indigenous people not only saves the environmental niche of these people in New Brunswick or Alberta, it is protecting all of us, the species. In contrast, the rational choices enforced by the ideologies and institutions controlled by the rich and the powerful is driving the human race towards extinction. I'm told the annual budget of the Harvard University is about $100 billion, single university. It is thus an issue about the salient authorship of knowledge. The issue of knowledge emerged vividly nearer home in the jungles surrounding the Nilgiri Hills in the state of Odisha. And I was hoping that some of the people involved in that brilliant struggle will be here. Now these hills contain about, for those who don't know, these hills contain about 72 million tons of high-grade bauxite, the source of aluminium, which the mining giant euphemistically called Vedanta wants to extract to feed into giant factories built on this land. After years of resistance by the local poor, mostly tribals, who had lived on this land for thousands of years, and much manipulation and show of muscles by the state, financed by the mining oligarchy, the government was compelled to organize a referendum for 12 carefully selected villages when the fate of thousands of villages was involved. The government hoped that by carefully selecting the 12 villages, they will ensure the vote in favor of Vedanta. And that's a constitutional requirement, that you have to have the majority of the people must agree for the deforestation that is involved. Anyway, so these 12 carefully selected villages. As one of the many moving studies of this report, using the democratic and peaceful resource of their own panchayats, which are the units of local self-government, village after village among these 12 gathered en masse amid heavy security cover of central paramilitary and state forces, ignoring the guns and bayonets, unlettered forest dwellers, and I emphasize the word unlettered used by one reviewer, unlettered forest dwellers, Dongriya Kod and Kutia Kod tribals, and Gauda and Harijan non-tribals, spoke of a religion embedded in the hills' pristine ecology. They told the district judge, appointed observer to the meetings by the apex court, that mining will destroy their god and their source of sustenance. Over 100 perennial streams, fruit trees like those of jackfruit and mangoes, spices like turmeric and ginger, wild roots, tubers and mushroom, apart from the land for shift and burn cultivation, dongar, where they grow an inviable mix of native millets, pulses and oil seeds. Having said this, each village unanimously rejected the Vedanta project. Niyamgiri Hills survived. Mark the word unlettered used by the reporter. The people themselves ratified the view of their own stupidity. The people themselves ratified the view, so Tunguru Machi, a Kutia Kod tribal, while speaking to the judge, declared at his village council meeting that we will die like Birsa Munda and Rindo Machi. Both Munda and Machi led tribal uprisings against the British, mostly on the same causes, similar causes. If you don't give up now, we are a Murkhya Jati, illiterate people who will never listen to you. This illiteracy, the absence of letters, the stupidity of the ancient belief in protecting a god of the hills might just provide the answer to the question of whether the species will survive after all. What does this scenario mean for education policy? What does it mean exactly to prioritize and adopt the knowledge systems of the Murkhya to save the species and the planet? In the limited time available to me, I will try to understand what these questions amount to. No grand solution at all. Ever since liberal education became the agenda at the turn of the last century, and we saw a very fine presentation on this just now, education of the poor and the marginalized has concerned a range of progressive writers. Some of them were discussed with A.S. Neil and others. I will briefly touch upon two of them outside the modern European, modernist European context to expand the argument really. So Rabindranath Tagore from India and Paulo Freire to suggest why these responses to the issue of survival of the species are inadequate. Namely, these progressive responses are inadequate. Tagore was deeply troubled by the extreme elitism of the British enforced education system that catered only to the children of the privileged. As is well known, he was also deeply critical of the kind of education that was imparted, the question of kind of education that was raised from the audience, I think, quite justifiably. As is well known, he was also deeply critical of the kind of education that was imparted, the rote learning that Paulo Freire later identified as the banking method, those who have read the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Instead, Tagore advocated an enlightened and elaborate version of education for fullness, he called it, Sarvangin Shikha, that included not just the education of the intellect, combining the most universal aspects of Western and Eastern high culture, but also the education of feeling for the other, that extended to feeling for nature and cosmos. In this sense, he criticized the one-sidedness of the education that only imparted bookish knowledge in a narrow, pragmatic sense. His conception of education did not reject the ideals of Western enlightenment, but sought to embed it in a wider conception of learning that he thought embraced the whole human. Purno Manush, that was his concept. Now, there is no convincing evidence that the knowledge systems that constituted Tagore's conception of Sarvangin Shikha included the knowledge systems of the unlettered, even in its margins. So his lament about the absence of the poor from the field of education may be viewed as a humanitarian lament. Why aren't they achieving what we have already achieved? It's a humanitarian lament, and I stress the word humanitarian because Paulo Freire, as you see, gave another word called humanist. Not really a humanistic one, to use the distinction suggested by Paulo Freire, and to which I return. In fact, there is evidence that Tagore viewed the poor and the marginalized as ignorant, dull, and voiceless, to whom language needs to be imparted. Hope needs to be aroused in those broken hearts. So, Eishom Muro Mlan Mukhe Dite Habe Bhasha, Ei Klanto Bhagno Buke Jagia Tulite Habe Asha, for those who know Bangla. And the knowledge that is supposed to enlighten the poor is the high culture knowledge already imparted to the elite. Needless to say, this task of pulling the poor out of their misery through Sarvangin Shikha required novel educational practices such as teaching in mother tongue, using local flora and fauna as examples, active agency of the learner, the top-of-one model of shunning bounded classrooms and holding learning sessions in the open air and so on is all very familiar. Yet the knowledge that was so imparted, the kind of knowledge we're talking about, the knowledge that was so imparted consisted of the products of the elite high culture, from the Upanishads to modern science, via literature, art, and sophisticated musical form, via the Virgils and the Homers and the Shakespeares to Newton and so on. And on the Indian side, on the Vedanta, down to, I don't know, Ramakrishna. I think the point about the ultimately elitist character of Tagore's otherwise enlightened conception of education can be strengthened with an example of educational practice that appears to contradict my claim. And I'm very honored to mention it to you because I could not locate any official document for this, but I can recount this curious practice from my own experience as a student in Tagore's school at Shantiniketan. So I recall, every afternoon, children from Patobhavan, that's his school, were transported in the university bus. And it was an old bus. I think there was an American company called Dodge in those days. So the Dodge buses it had a nose like that of a dolphin. And it was a squarish kind of thing. We used to call it Paungruti bus, the bread bus. Okay. So that's only one bus in the university in those days. That is talking about mid-60s. So every afternoon, children from Patobhavan were transported in the university bus in batches to Shilpo Shodon at the rural setting of Sriniketan, that was a couple of kilometers away from Shantiniketan, the location for rural education and reconstruction to which Tagore put huge emphasis. There we sat down on the floor to learn about woodcraft, papier-mâché, basket weaving, lacquerwork, and so on, from the ill-clad, impoverished, but highly skillful village artisans themselves. During that period of active hands-on learning, some of the rural folk were our teachers. Our education thus included some of the knowledge systems of the unlettered and a reversal of the class role. No wonder this novel education practice was soon abandoned due to logistic reasons. It's not there anymore. Yet the point remains that the appreciation and adoption of rural culture was restricted to the crafts of a folk nature. Elite high culture still formed the central ingredient for the development of sensitive intellect. It was an afternoon sojourn once a week, and even that was abandoned without much lament from any quarters that I know. Several decades later, Paulo Freire addressed the issue of resistance to the ideologies and institutions of the elite more directly. The task for education, he felt, was to reverse the process of dehumanization in which the oppressed found themselves. The process of dehumanization tries to present itself as a historical fact. The stupidity, the inherent stupidity. So it has to be taken care of. And so the struggle for humanization, for the emancipation of labor, for the overcoming of alienation, for the affirmation of men and women as persons is made to look like meaningless. Now, this struggle is possible, of course, only because dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny, but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressors, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. Now, so what should be the aims of humanization? What's the mode of struggle that can be enforced through education? Familiar things. Freire elaborates following George Lucas that a revolutionary educational practice aims to, and I quote, explain to the masses their own action, to clarify and illuminate that action, both regarding its relationship to the objective facts by which it was prompted and regarding its purposes, as was pointed out. The more the people unveil this challenging reality, which is the object of their transforming action, the more critically they enter that reality. In this way, they are consciously activating the subsequent development of their experiences. Freire insists this form of education to be essentially pre-revolutionary, so that the oppressed can proceed to a revolutionary overthrow of the unjust order. Freire thus goes much beyond Tagore to view education not only as a humanitarian mode, which I suggested earlier, not only as a humanitarian mode to include the oppressed. Education, in fact, triggers humanization of the oppressed by enabling them to erect the other side of the barricade. So let us call it the proletarian mode. In my view, what the proletarian mode, despite its enlightened and revolutionary aspects, what it misses is the tribal mode or the indigenous mode. And I think there is a central distinction here between the proletarian mode and the tribal mode. The proletarian mode essentially is a mode within capitalism or within the neoliberal order. The proletarian is a product of that order. The tribal has its inherent historical existence outside this order, unless the order, of course, encroaches by decimating its environment. So the knowledge system, what we're talking about, has existed outside this order for thousands of years, more or less untouched until very recently by liberal education, essentially promoted from the West. It is unclear if the envisaged overthrow of the unjust order will in fact enhance the prospects for the species as a whole. The humanized education achieved through the struggle of the working masses will no doubt usher in an era of proletarian freedom. But will it ensure survival for us all? The answer will depend on the content of the proletarian mode, the knowledge systems so advocated. Here the prospects do not appear to be as revolutionary as the emancipation of a section of the people, namely the proletariat. It's good for the proletariat. Is it good for the species? There is little evidence that pre-revolutionary Paul Freire does not really get into this topic at length, if I can, as far as I know. And there is little evidence that pre-revolutionary education practices among the masses undertaken by revolutionary forces address the issue raised here. I've looked at the curriculum in Soviet Union at the transition stage, that is called what is called the Soviet stage. Then I've looked at the curriculum in Mao's Long March program, and Freire actually referred to these things with appreciation. So he has made frequent references to political work of Mao during the pre-revolutionary phase in China. Following these examples and their implementation during, say, the struggle in Vietnam, certain forms of practice have emerged with a kind of a universal sanction among revolutionary forces. These kinds of revolutionary forces, the Maoist kind of forces. For example, Maoists in India have organized Young Communist Mobile School or Basic Communist Training School that host select groups of 25 to 30 tribal children in the age group of 12 to 15. These children receive intensive training for 6 months in a curriculum, and the curriculum is interesting, in a curriculum consisting of basic concepts of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, age group 12 to 15, tribal children. Basic concepts of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Hindi and English, maths, science, social science, computers, and different types of weapons. Although the pupil concerned consist entirely of tribal children, there is no evidence that the ancient knowledge systems of the tribals form any significant part of the curriculum at all, except that these instructions are done in Gondi or on other mother tongues available. In fact, much of the curriculum, including lessons in modern science and especially weapons training, involving not bows and arrows, but automatic rifles, light machine guns, high-power explosive devices, and the like, which go directly against the foundations of tribal culture and are pointers to the extinction of the species. It seems plausible to hold then that the most progressive, enlightened forms of thinking on education fail to offer a sustainable perspective on the survival of the species. In some grim historical sense, the prospects seem irreversible for the enlightened conception of knowledge that is primarily responsible for bringing the species to the brink of extinction is the only one we have, apparently. In other words, a real solution to the issue of survival requires that humans learn to forget, or at least to hold any further action under suspension pending severe criticism of the knowledge systems currently advanced in the most dominating centers of learning. I have one example in mind, which I've heard only anecdotally. I don't know if it is historically correct. I'm told that the Japanese emperors denied the use of gunpowder in their army for a long, long time, although the use of gunpowder was known to the army. The argument was very interesting. The argument was basically the empire said, well, in a sword fight, you are actually facing your enemy on an individual basis. So you have to make a moral choice about killing a human being. And that moral choice is available to you. But in a gunfight, you are firing at an unknown, unseen individual, so you don't face the moral choice. So to keep the moral choice alive about killing a human being, they actually shun the technology of gunpowder, although it was available. So denial of knowledge purposely for saving lives. And the gunpowder, of course, is one of the most significant inventions, technological inventions, with use in almost every aspect of environmental destruction, but also used in the award of the Nobel Prize. Now, if indigenous knowledge systems currently resisting extraction of hydrocarbons and bauxite from forests is our primary route for survival, every bit of knowledge beyond indigenous knowledge, therefore, must be subjected to serious critique for their relevance. Do we need quantum theory? Do we need Bach? Are the Upanishads of any use? I'm aware of the possible inconsistency in what I am proposing. While the subliminal suggestion is to defray action on all forms of so-called high culture, aren't we led into this forlorn conclusion precisely by dint of the wonderful scientific work conducted by Ernst Mayr and his colleagues at Harvard? It's costly, but it told us what the future looks like. So isn't it imperative that solutions to the dangers posed by the culture of enlightenment is to be found within enlightenment itself? I don't know what the answer is, but it seems that the very notion of enlightenment could be viewed as problematic until prominent space is found within it to incorporate indigenous knowledge as an instrument for the survival of the species. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mukherji. We will now have we invite a few questions from the audience. Sure. The speaker has requested that we take one question at a time. So the last but one row there.
Thank you for a very important talk. I wonder at the attitude that we come into this world as savage animals that need adjustment. If we ask ourselves, what's the biological function of childhood and youth, and we see that the salient characteristic of children and young people is a fantastic ability to learn. The biological function then would be to adapt to changing environment. Changing societies and cultures, of course, are a natural phenomenon. So if we have a modernist school system, schools and parents, that sequester children, take them out of contact with the world, and provide them with curricula supposedly to teach them about the world with which they have so little contact, the damage perhaps is not only that they don't learn what they could learn, or even that they do learn ideologies and knowledge which is not really relevant, but A, it may deform their ability to learn in a way most never recover as adults. Of course, adults can learn too. So my question is just to ask you to respond to this. It seems what is often called the hidden curriculum, sequestering children, inhibiting profoundly their opportunity to express themselves, even to move, to be creative, to think, under the impact of controlled curriculum and controlled methodology, is in fact disabling our species' biological function for adapting to tumultuously changing circumstances.
It's not working? Okay. Okay, thank you. The questioner is Steve DeGuilo from New Mexico. Yes, I think we need to distinguish two issues. I agree with your view of the child as a natural learner. It's not particularly peculiar to the human species. In fact, there are many very interesting cases where the human species are in fact kind of slow learners compared to other species. One classic example that was actually experimentally done, again at Harvard, Mike Coffin, the experiment showed that one-day-old goats can learn depth perception. You know, depth perception, I know that the experiment was on the cliff experiment, the famous visual cliff experiment of Kaufman. And a one-day-old goats can learn. They will step back from the cliff. Even if they can feel a glass plate under them, they will step back if there is a visual image of the cliff. Human children don't do that. They will just walk through, and they'll fall over until 6 or 7 months. So learning is part of the biological mechanism built in, and very fast. And very young songbirds begin to coo with their very ineffective throat, begin to coo and try to imitate, and therefore showing that they have recognized the complexity of the melody of the parents, of the conspecific, and almost right after birth. So learning, of course, is a device that nature has planted in organic systems in a rather wonderful fashion. But I'm not quite talking about the natural ability to learn, that aspect, which is so important, of course. What I'm talking about is indigenous knowledge. So it is adult knowledge that I'm talking about, stable historical knowledge that has been reached after, hundreds and, not hundreds and thousands, thousands of years of reflection on flora and fauna and natural habitat, and has reached certain forms of stability. And they have, very sophisticated, their own high cultures about the Niyamgiri Rajas and the songs, if you listen to them. They have their own music. The music does not have the huge technological elaboration of different kinds of strings and percussion instruments and the concert halls and all that. They just sing directly with their voice, with hardly any instrumentation. But the quality of the songs and the content of the songs tell you what the level of their stable, historically salient high culture is. So we are talking about adult knowledge here. Okay. And it's quite possible that even in the case of the acquisition of this knowledge by tribal children, there are the same problems about curbing the natural instincts and so on. I don't know how the learning goes on, but at least it's not enforced by a direct school system that does it somewhat more somewhat more structurally and with social sanction. So that's not the issue, really, although I appreciate the issue. The issue really is, what does it mean for us to think of that knowledge, to prioritize that knowledge that seems to create the conditions for resistance to the forms of knowledge that are creating the conditions for the destruction of the species. So should we view this as a contest between two forms of knowledge? And if that is the contest, the real contest, two forms of knowledge, capitalism, socialism, other things aside, if that is the main concern, then how does education address that issue? Just pedagogy, how to teach the oppressed is not the issue here. It's the issue of how to incorporate the knowledge of the marginalized, the indigenous people, into the mainstream knowledge of the species. That's a very different issue from what either Tagore or Paul Freire were articulating.
Thank you. I have a question. Thank you for both the speaker. It's really insightful the way you talk and the insights you give on the liberal education. I have nice to hear all those thoughts. But from your speech, I found that it's very nice talking here in this conference room, and outside there is a war going on for the survival of the fittest, the survival of the species. And if this war is going on, not only within human, but with the other species, okay, who will survive? There is always a quest how to survive in this world. And when freedom is also limited by law, we have a law all around, so we are not totally free or independent. We cannot choose everything whatever we want. And when education costs us, not only in terms of money, but in terms of our most important resource, which is time, in this sort of scenario, how do you see freedom of liberal education will propel, or we can reach to heights? Because you also said that we sometimes learn, and very often afterwards we unlearn, and we forgot the things, because education doesn't create impact what actually it creates it should create. So how both of you sees the point? Because laws limits us our freedom. Survival is one of the basic need. We cannot talk in this ambient space, the outside going on. And thirdly, education really costs us.
So just to him also, so is he allowed to respond? I would hope so, because...
Yeah, maybe in the summing up.
Okay. Yes. Okay. In a short paper, in 35 minutes, could not spell out all the angles that I wish to take on this thing. And it's a new research that I've taken up, so it will take time to formulate all the issues. One issue I'm glad you pointed out, of course, is to challenge the very notion of a liberal education. Because I think there's a recent paper by our colleague at Columbia, Akhil Bilgrami, who has questioned the idea of liberal education as if it is not an identity education, identity thesis. As if liberal education, as if by definition is universal. That has been the claim, the modernist claim throughout for the last few hundred years. That liberal education is kind of axiomatic because it is open-ended. It incorporates all views. It can be marshaled in any direction you want to. It's inherently progressive. There's no alternative to it. So that view has been around for 500 years, and with precedence in the Greek tradition, and also I would say definitely in the Indian high culture tradition also, essentially. The time has come to question that view, whether it is really universal, or there are assumptions built into it that by definition negate the possibility of incorporating other forms of knowledge which don't fit into it. So I'm insisting on that point again, because in the case of tribal knowledge, it's very different from the proletarian concerns. That was one of the points of my paper, I think. I could not develop it fully. The point is, the proletarian concerns are concerns within the libertarian order. And then it's an unjust word order in terms of the class structure. If you remove the class structure, you have a socialist or a communist order. Then the unjust part is gone, but the liberal education still stays. What we are witnessing in the case of this environmental crisis and the extinction problem that I'm raising, if it is a real problem, then it's a very different scale and the grade and the location of the problem outside the domain of modernity. But historically current, tribal knowledges are there. It's not that we are going back to Hindutva or some kind of an ancient knowledge system or, repenting about the past. It is there. It is under practice. And this practice is now coupled with resistance. And it is stable adult knowledge. So it is really a contest between which kind of knowledge you want to pick. And I don't quite, and many ingredients of this knowledge, of course, is against the principal threats of the rational choices which are advocated in liberal education. So that's why I pointed out that even in the Maoist revolutionary curriculum, maths, science, physics, computers are central for the child group. And if that component of knowledge is essential by definition to liberal education, then hard to see how the notion of liberal education will incorporate the indigenous knowledge systems, which seems to be the only way out. So one option is to ignore the tribal indigenous knowledge, which has been the case, or to marginalize it, or to pay lip service to it, or create their own niche kind of thing. Let the tribals have their own knowledge. Let's create the niche for them. Okay, but it does not become universal. The other choice, of course, is to question the very idea of education that makes these distinctions.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm reminded by your talk that I gave a talk myself a few years ago at the Great Britain Philosophy of Education Society called Education for Survival, on the same topic. It's very difficult, I find, to talk about these things without talking about an immense range of interconnected things. It's hard to think your way through it. I agree that the perspective of indigenous peoples, it has to come into this, is very important. And with some of what you've said about liberal education, but I think there's a strand of the sustainability literature which takes a very broad brush opposition to enlightenment in a way which was hinted at in some of what you've said. And I would encourage resisting that for a couple of reasons. One, I think when you're thinking about what education for sustainability, if I can call it that, would amount to, you're going to have to think about what it would be for different people in different places. So when I've tried to think about it myself, I've focused on what it would be for Americans, where we're in a distinctive position, which you alluded to at the beginning, and where I think for countries like the United States, and a focus of it has to be education for a kind of global cooperation, which does attune our students much more than they are to the realities of the impact of how we're all living on people and distant others around the world. So that's of a piece with liberal education understood in a certain way. It would require a lot more education in geography than we typically get in countries like the United States. It's not oppositional to science or to enlightenment. It's a way of trying to make it better. But I think your story, I should stop because I could talk about this as long as probably as you would like to talk about it yourself. But I think the dynamics that generate and sustain the path we're on predate enlightenment, predate modern science, predate capitalism. And so as important as Chomsky's remarks are about capitalism, I think the problems were already recognized in some of the dynamics of competition were already recognized by Plato. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That was very enlightening, in the right sense of enlightenment. And so we can play around with stupidity and enlightenment and put them together, I guess, without any inconsistency. Yes, you are absolutely right. I mean, the reflective ambiguity is exactly the concern. And if that concern is built into the educational practices that are now going to unfold, it might be one way out. I'm not denying the role of science, but which kind of science? Focused on what? And what structures of science are to be given priority to, and institutions built to support it. A lot of science is corporate driven, okay, precisely of the kind of knowledge that science produces. I mean, the dams and the ecological disasters and the bauxite mining and the attendant factories are not built by the corporates. They provide the funds. It's built by the scientists, the technologists, the engineers, and the great minds. And there are differential equations to be solved. And so high culture is involved at every step of these things. So that's the whole point. But the same high culture can also be used, of course, to challenge some of these more motivations. And the choices are not easy at all, because it will now require a huge lot of research to find the alternatives, research in technology and science, and in philosophical thinking and in social thinking. Okay, apart from the context of resistance that needs to be to continuously, that will give voice to the demand for these new forms of knowledge. Where is the funding for this going to come from? That's the challenge that Chomsky sees very, very clearly. Where's the funding? Because now we need an alternate laboratory to do these things. So, and one aspect of the ambiguity can be addressed by simply harnessing back the stock of knowledge that we already have. In some sense, we already do it. For example, in the choice of agriculture, for example, we can get into the details now. In the choice of agriculture, for example, we do ask the local crop producers, the forest dwellers, and the people who have been cultivating for centuries about the choice of the crop, about the choice of the density of the soil, about the cropping season, and so on. Okay, so their knowledge is actually a feedback. And wherever this kind of knowledge has been violated by universalization of high-yielding varieties and so on, disasters have happened. So we are now going back to those kinds of local production systems, activated by traditional local knowledge. So there are cases where these things are already happening, but not at the level, not at the crucial junctures of destruction, and nothing against the military warfare, for example. So those sciences have to be developed. Yeah.
Last question, please. Ajit here.
I think you rightly pointed out that nature does not distinguish between intelligence and stupidity, but you seem to assume in your argument that nature does distinguish between Western knowledge and tribal knowledge. So that is the first point. So, and the second point is that I was wondering when I was listening to you, and after your talk was over, that whether the stupidity that has, in your argument, has brought us to the brink of extinction, is it because of the failure of liberal education, or is it because of the success of liberal education? And you seem to assume some success of liberal education which has brought us to the failure of stupidity. So I'm not sure which way the argument will turn out depending upon what you assume. And the third point is that I think that somewhere in your argument you seem to be diluting the aim and purpose of education, because aim and purpose of education obviously is survival, but it is survival with good life. Okay, so I think, and then it will throw up its own problems. So I had these three things in mind.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I didn't quite use the word Western as a kind of universal category, And I bracketed that thing with the Eastern high culture also. I have the same criticism about both. So it's not just Western. And of course, as was pointed out by someone, I guess, that there have been much of the criticism about the dominant forms of corporate-driven education structures and education institutions have come from within Western knowledge itself. Much of the criticism has come from there. And you can find traditional cultures with the same kind of effectiveness within Western societies. I mean, maybe the indigenous people in Canada are kind of marginalized, but someone mentioned the Hutterites and the Amish people, very central to that. I mean, we have many kinds of Amish and Hutterites. If you study the actual history and actual location, they are at the center of society in many, many cases. They have their own schools, they have their own traditions of knowledge. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's no point in making a big deal about Eastern, Western, or Western and tribal and those binaries. They don't have much meaning. What is significant, of course, is what is the dominant influence. Okay, and I think that the concept of a liberal education has become the dominant one in that sense, that you cannot do without it, because that's an absolute value for the species. That's what I'm challenging, because that simply does not fit well with the tribal life. And if it can be challenged, then maybe the notion of good life, which is also fostered by this same liberal education, can also be challenged. What is good life? So if everything is under challenge, then actions can be defrayed. That's why I gave that Japanese gunpowder example. It is actually defrayed. Everyone has knowledge of nuclear. Why is there such popular resistance to nuclear reactors as so-called peaceful use of the nuclear energy? Why is there such a resistance to that? Because ultimately, if we think about it, it is a resistance to the availability of that knowledge. And even if we know that we can produce nuclear energy, okay, we are just not going to do so because we don't know what the consequences are for the species. So I think these questions have to be discussed more thoroughly.